Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon, we are so lucky to be joined by Dr. Jeff Green, who is a professor and the director of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. And if I can say so myself, he is truly a Renaissance man, as one of the most influential political theorists of modern and ancient political philosophers, having published 3 books and receiving numerous accolades, such as a Henry Tun Award for Excellence, alongside the first book prize in political theory from the American Political Science Association. So it's really our pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Green. But before we dive into any of our questions, how are you doing today?
Very good. Nice to be with you. Thanks.
Great. So the first question, and it's kind of a tradition on our podcast, is that for all of our guests, we kind of want to open with a question of dumb luck. So if it's not evident by the dead giveaway of our podcast name and our faces, we're twins. So we are wondering if you could take that 50-50 blind guess at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds.
Okay. I'm going to say that you are Jerry.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Not a lot of people get that right, so yeah. Great. Now that you know how to tell us apart, let's just jump straight into the interview. Now, obviously, Jerry and I know all the incredible things you've done in the realm of democratic theory. For those who are less familiar with who you are, we are wondering if you could please introduce yourself, maybe some passions that you have in your life, and how you got really interested and involved in political philosophy/theory in the first place.
Well, I've been teaching at the University of Pennsylvania now for almost 20 years. I'm in the political science department. My focus is political theory. And as you mentioned, for the last 8 years, I've also been directing the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. And so I have interests in these topics, democratic theory, politics more generally. And I like to explore those questions through the broader tradition of political thought, spanning from ancient times down to the present. I was a history major in college and didn't know that much about political theory before I went to law school, where I worked for Bruce Ackerman, a leading legal scholar, and did some research with him and sort of had my eyes open to the discipline of political theory, fell in love with it, and went on to pursue a PhD. And so I was a late bloomer, I would say, into the discipline that I live in now. I really didn't know much about it at all when I was your age, although we all are political beings. And so when you study political theory or democratic theory, you're not only studying it as an expert, but you're studying it, as anyone else might talk about it, because we all relate to it on the personal level. So, in grade school and high school, I was always very interested in history as my favorite class, but I had to, I think, go further in my education to learn about the variety of disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. So I think, political theory is like history in some ways. Some of the methods of scholarship are similar, but whereas history tends to focus on a specific time and place, I think political theory leads one to bounce around a bit more from time and place and can be more conceptual in its focus. And so I think that was attractive to me when I was in my early 20s, although there are all sorts of overlaps between political theory and history, political theory and philosophy, and other disciplines as well, like literature. So that's a bit of my background.
Yeah, great. Just to continue on that conversation, as you mentioned, and we obviously know that the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy has really been a pioneering force in just not only analyzing how democracy works, but actively reshaping its future. From the Politics on the Edge lecture series to the Mitchell Center's very own podcast, to hosting the ideological, very diverse debates at the Penn Political Union, and so much more. It really offers a multifaceted platform for dialogue, research, and engagement. But for those of the viewers and the listeners at home who are less familiar, we're wondering if you could briefly describe what the center is, and as a director, what are your future goals for deepening democratic engagement?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. In one form or another, the center's been around now for 18 years. Mm-hmm. and it has a twin mission, good for today's discussion, I suppose. On one hand, fostering scholarship about democracy. We foster scholarship on the undergraduate, graduate, postdoctoral levels, but also we hold public events on political events and political debates more about democracy broadly conceived. And so we try, when possible, to include student voices in those debates and discussions, and we try to have those debates be, civil and multi-partisan. And so we have different ongoing programs that lead to us organizing our efforts to put on public events, some more scholarly, some more public-facing. You mentioned some of those venues. The Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy venue focuses on economic issues as they relate to democracy. We have our Race and Politics venue, as you mentioned, our Penn Political Union, which brings student-led political parties into discussion and debate with each other, often with outside speakers. Prominent members of civil society come to the union and debate students. And this year we started our Poetry and Politics program, where we post regularly about poems and try to probe what literature and poetic imagination might have to say about politics that other forms of discourse can't quite reach.
Right.
And I think as we move to the next period in the center, I think we're just going to double down on some of the same commitments we've had thus far, which is to be interdisciplinary, which is to be global and not at all just focused on the United States or a specific nation state, to build bridges between people who disagree, and to more perhaps than ever before have a humanistic component to the programming to complement its primary grounding in the social sciences. And also, I should say, when possible, we deal with the natural sciences as well. In a few days, we're going to have an event on COVID with some scholars who are critically examining the American response, and that's co-sponsored with our medical school.
Wow.
So we try to be a hub at Penn, bringing together also different parts of the university to come together about political and civic issues.
Wow.
And we have a book series as well. So we also put out books periodically on democracy-related themes. So we do a bunch of different things, but I think you've gotten to the core of it.
Well, yeah, I think the global and interdisciplinary aspect of that really stands out to me. So that's really cool. For the next part of the interview, we're going to sort of shift gears and talk a little bit more about your work in more specific. So we are really curious to sort of discuss the tension at the heart of democratic life that you have outlined in a lot of your works, where on one hand, there's this urgent need to sort of stay committed to improving democracy. For instance, to believe that the future can be more just and more participatory than the past. Well, on the other hand, there's also sort of this sobering recognition that today and tomorrow, this framework feels almost unreal in the sense where ideals like true equal enfranchisement, political agency may never be fully realized for everyone. And you provided a really interesting framework here, which is to be both realistic without falling into cynicism. Yet, unfortunately, many young people today are falling into that group of cynicism and increasingly disillusioned with politics today. For instance, in the 2024 US presidential election, only about 44% of eligible voters between the ages of 18 to 29 showed out, and a third of Americans under 30 hold negative views about politics, reflecting, I think, a broader wave of cynicism, especially as these figures are likely to be even lower amongst youth who sort of don't have the ballot and who can't vote right now. So our question is, in your view, how do you think the youth can stay engaged in democracy right now without falling into that apathy and cynicism trap?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And I think you set up the situation nicely. You described my own views very nicely, which is to be realistic about the power imbalances in our democratic societies, and not be blind to them, but to still be trying to improve things and to sketch ideals that don't promise complete equality, which I think is unrealistic, or complete end of illegitimacy, but work within a more complicated, difficult situation. I think one way that I consider it is the few-many distinction. Are we operating with the differentiation between the few and the many as a basically permanent sociological set of categories in our politics, or are we not? And the more idealistic veins in our politics. Imagine we're going to get beyond the few and the many, and we're all going to just be fellow citizens deliberating about the common good,
Mhm.
etc. And I think that's where my realism probably is most at play, that I say, no, we're going to have this distinction between the few and the many. But that distinction doesn't have to lead only to frustration. It doesn't have to lead to cynicism. It doesn't have to alienate young people or other voters. I think it can become clarifying for a type of politics that, in addition to passing laws that might be in the so-called public interest, would involve a politics that aims to limit and regulate um, and survey and monitor the elite power holders. And so that has been a running theme in some of my work, and one that I think could be exciting for a young person who may be on the fence about politics. You know, the reminder that, hey, we should not just see politics as passing laws that are going to make our world better, although that is incredibly important. There's a whole other dimension to our politics having to do with the contestation between the few and the many.
Mhm.
And other polities that have inspired me, in particular the ancient Athenians, to some degree the ancient Romans, seemed at times to have institutions that took for granted the distinction between the few and the many, but involved efforts to contain and regulate the few. And I see that as a genuine democratic ambition.
Yeah.
What makes, on this reading, democracy different from oligarchy is not that there are no elites in a democracy, but that in a democracy, unlike an oligarchy, the elites are burdened in unusual ways. And so, and if we want to be really optimistic, those burdens could be honors. You know, they don't only have to be suffered as coercion by the few. If done properly, and we haven't done it properly, I think they could be experienced, these regulations, as a sign of distinction, a kind of legalized noblesse oblige, I suppose, would be a running ideal throughout my work. And that ideal is not fully um, utopian. It's not fully satisfying because, you know, why do we have this difference between the few and the many? But I think that we do, at least in the liberal democratic polities that we're familiar with, and most other ones as well.
For sure. Yeah, just following up on that, I guess sort of want to talk about, how democracy is commonly understood, both now and in the past. So it seems like the dominant modern framing, at least the one that is often presented and internalized by the public, is that the promise of democracy lies in representation. That, through voting, that ordinary people can have their voices heard and their concerns meaningfully addressed. But as you pointed out in your work, this promise is very difficult to verify, and in a lot of circumstances, just completely unverifiable. Thus, it becomes almost problematic in the sense that we don't know how much representation is happening, when it's happening, which also simultaneously means that we don't know how much we're being empowered right now and how much we can even become empowered in the future because we just don't have that benchmark. So in your view, what do you think is the most, I guess, common misconception about how democracy functions today? And what do you think would be a more legitimate or honest way to frame democracy for the general public, especially in a way that I think acknowledges its limitations without just completely undermining its entire value set?
Right. I think, again, you say it really well. And I agree with that assessment of our situation. And I think that voting is important, especially when not everyone has the right to vote. It cannot help but be experienced as extremely important. But I think the number one thing to get beyond is seeing the voting process as the be all and end all
Yeah.
of democracy. And if we can get beyond the vote, not because we don't do it, not because we don't care about having our preferences when we have them translated into policy, but if we don't see that phenomenon as the entirety of democracy, we can open ourselves up to other ambitions that I think will have more to do, in addition to aspirations at representation, with regulating elite power holders, whether economic or political, and making sure that we don't fall into oligarchic tendencies. Representation is the more purely ideal. It is the happiest story that, oh, guess what? We're going to have a politics where the laws are fully consistent with the preferences and values of the electorate, or that's are going to be how we conceive of democracy. But as you pointed out, there are problems with the representational ideal. It's hard to totally take it down. I think it would be hard to say that we don't have any representation or that all states are equally representing their people. I think we can, that doesn't sound right, but the more you look at it, as you were pointing out, we don't have clear metrics for defining representation. We don't have clear metrics for knowing when public opinion is influencing public policy. And that's a surprise for one thing, but it's very important practically because we're talking here about popular empowerment, right? What's democracy most literally? The empowerment of the people. If you can't measure with any clarity when a people is being empowered, then that's something to be careful about. That's something to be skeptical about, because then too easily the ideal of popular empowerment can be co-opted by people, by leaders who maybe will manipulate the claims to representation, or at least engage in rhetoric that can't really be verified. Are citizens in France better or less represented today than citizens in Germany? Are citizens in Canada better or less represented in 2025 than they were in 2019? It's hard to answer those questions. And I'm not saying we throw representation out the window, but the more we realize that we can't give ourselves quick answers to these basic questions, maybe means that representation and with it voting shouldn't be the sole concern or metric of our democratic processes.
Yeah, for sure. I think whatever all the conversations we just had really ties in perfectly with the next section we're going to discuss, which surrounds spectatorship. And for all the viewers at home who are unfamiliar with it, it's the idea that citizens are observers of our democracy, of our political process, rather than active participants. And as we talked about, with voting not being the end all of everything and offering very limited influence on the actual policies that gets passed. So for the next part of the interview, we kind of just want to focus on how we can confront that reality and explore some of the solutions that you propose. So the first of which is reducing the distance, which is bridging the distance between the spectators, the average Joe living inside our society, and the political elites, whether it be through electoral reform, as we said, holding public accountability, making sure that people are being actually represented, or addressing the economic inequality that boosts participation. But again, in practice, this proves to be very difficult, especially just considering the scale of modern politics, where to many, I think voting remains largely symbolic, and obviously there's socioeconomic disparities will always cast, I think, as you put it in one of your books and in your work really perfectly, this shadow of unfairness, especially on the political opportunity that different individuals have access to. So given all these constraints, to what extent do you think that investing our political capital and time in trying to really fully kind of bridge this gap truly effective? And when does it just risk being merely performative?
You're asking to what degree can spectatorship bridge this gap between the spectators and the elites, or to what degree politics in general, however conceived, can bridge this gap?
Yeah, the latter.
The latter. Yeah, I think that there are limits to how much this gap can be bridged, and thus we are going to be inevitably in some sort of spectatorial condition. The election is not a binding contract. Those who win it do not have to carry out the preferences of their electors. Very often, the electors don't have clear preferences on a variety of policies. Very often, the issues change while those who win election are in office. And we also know that there's the minority who didn't even vote for the people in office. For these and other reasons, I think we can't escape the phenomenon. If we just look at the experience of our politics, we can't get beyond an experience of ordinariness, where those who are in the ordinary mode experience others who are special, who are elite, on the public stage, having exceptional discretionary decision-making power which in an age such as ours can be extraordinarily consequential with regard to war and peace, with regard to the use of severely damaging, dangerous weapons, with regard to a host of a whole other set of issues. So, should there be an attempt to have better campaign finance legislation, better welfare state legislation that equals the playing field? Yes. Are some countries rightly applauded for being more egalitarian in their political cultures and educational systems, like Canada compared to the US? Yes. Um, but even in, the most egalitarian liberal democracies, Canada, Australia, Northern European states, there is a variety of ways where there is this gap between the ordinary and the exceptional. And part of that gap is the phenomenon of spectatorship, knowing that you're just an ordinary person in a mass society, watching typically distinct elites on the public stage, getting attention and having outsized political power. So I think that opens up another kind of democratic politics. How should the ordinary and the exceptional relate to each other? How should the ordinary and the elite relate to each other? And that's where a lot of my work is centered.
Right. I think just perfectly tie into that, the second facet or solution-esque type of like aspect that you point out in your work is the relationship between, like the average Joe and the elite. And the solution that you sort of point out is to single out and regulate the political and economic elites. And we were really intrigued and fascinated by your analysis, especially the analysis that you do in which you parallel how this was accomplished through a lot more historical democratic systems where democratic empowerment was, as you said, not limited to lawmaking or voting in that case. So practices like, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, but eisphora and antidosis, where the wealthy had to contribute materially and publicly do things such as justify their status. So I think in that system, these practices weren't just about, I guess, fiscal distribution or redistribution, but more so about the symbolic acknowledgement that society isn't fair. And I think I would take that a step farther to say that many would argue that it was precisely this recognition and acknowledgement that actually enabled societies or historical societies to begin addressing these injustices by placing unique democratic responsibilities or just responsibilities onto the elites. So our question is, in our modern world where class-based inequalities and elite influence are more entrenched now than ever before, do you see any modern democratic tools like, I don't know, maybe taxation or other new norms that could meaningfully check elite power while fostering a more honest like a recognition or acknowledgement of these systematic unfairnesses?
Yes, I do. And let me just back up a step and build off of how you frame things and suggest that maybe, there's a few prongs to democratization as I see it. There's the standard prong where we look to make sure everyone has the right to vote, and we look to have fair equality of opportunity with regard to political voice and educational opportunity, and approximate to the best of our ability a situation of free and equal citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's other prongs based on the fact that we're not going to get there and that we're going to have this elite ordinary citizen divergence, a divergence that isn't fully legitimate. And in my first book, I was arguing that we want those political elites to have to not be in control of their publicity. They have to, not just speak to us in a unidirectional, pre-programmed public relations way, but be shaken out of their comfort zone and be forced to engage in a spontaneous, contested way on the public stage. And in my second book, I'm focusing more on the economic elites and suggesting that they need to have some regulatory burdens placed upon them, burdens that may have some public benefit, but also play the symbolic role of acknowledging the lack of fully fair social relations, and perhaps, as you were suggesting, inspiring other forms of democratization, inspiring some of the other prongs. But you're asking, how realistic is it to expect the wealthy to have burdens like what the ancient Greek wealthy citizens had, the liturgies, where the wealthiest 80 or so families had to uniquely provide services to the state, services like building boats or putting on plays or building monuments. Given the mobility of capital, given the interest that wealthy have in avoiding taxes and tax flight to avoid it, what's realistic here? I think that in the public culture, in a non legally binding way, we see the billionaires pledge that's grown in our century, where extremely wealthy people have, on their own volition, committed themselves to giving a lot of their estate to charity upon their death. And I would say in the last 5 years or so, there's been more, not less, coordinated efforts among the wealthiest countries of the world to try to have certain basic tax rates for corporations. And so more coordination would be needed, but I do think that there's some evidence with a lot of fits and starts of us heading in that direction. But it is tricky. I think in older times, the wealthy were more committed to their specific territory. The nature of their wealth was often land, and so very much in the territory, and there wasn't this possibility of mobility. And so one could see an ethic of responsibility uh, grow out a little bit more naturally. Today, we don't have that situation with the nature of our wealth. But I think uh, it's partially a function of not even expecting it, not even having it on our horizon of things to aspire to, because we've been so focused on voting, so focused on representation, so focused on improving the livelihood of the least advantaged, which is a very noble thing that I fully support, that we don't fully recognize this other sociological category, the most advantaged, and see them as a category of interest in a democratic society, the way some of these ancient democracies did.
Yeah, I think that thank you so much for that nuanced response. And just talking a little bit more about what we can learn from ancient societies, I think this really ties in well with like the next question, which is I think the final facet that you touch upon is something so interesting, which is finding solace as a legitimate democratic need. And we were particularly struck by your example of Achilles, who in becoming a spectator of war finds contentment and happiness in this radical egalitarianism that renders politics and violence and war completely meaningless by affirming that all of our lives are equal. And I think this becomes increasingly clear when you talk about marginalized groups historically, such as the plebs of ancient Rome, where they were really the true spectators of politics, given that they were barred from voting or holding any political office whatsoever. So in that scenario, many of them turned towards, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Epicureanism, which emphasized pursuing only natural and necessary pleasures. And they really saw politics as a source of unnatural desires, whether it be like fame or trying to uphold a certain reputation, and which through their hedonic calculus believe they will inevitably lead to suffering. So our question is more of like from a philosophical, purely philosophical standpoint. In today's polarizing political climate, where many feel metaphorically very close to the plebs, do you see disengagement as a form of empowerment, perhaps turning towards apoliticism or anti-politicism, or perhaps more of an extra-politicism standpoint, having this temporary withdrawal and the possibility of return to politics? Or is this the time precisely where civic engagement should be most essential?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question. I think that I was struck as a student of the history of political thought how often the earliest meditations on human equality did not lead in a political direction, but in a more ambiguous relationship to politics.
Mm-hmm.
Achilles, to me, is the earliest uh, person in the literary tradition of the West who talks about the idea of human equality in Book
Yeah.
9 of the Iliad. But there, as you're referencing, he's saying it when he's withdrawn from war and politics. He's having this egalitarian insight in a moment of withdrawal, and his egalitarianism is encouraging the withdrawal. We're all equal,
Right.
truly and deeply. So what's the point of getting involved in politics and trying to equalize things? We're already equal. All lives are equal. The beggar, the very powerful person. And it's a radical view that maybe one can sympathize with, but it takes you outside of normal political commitments. And the Epicureans, and this was a philosophy very popular among ordinary citizens in the Roman Republic, as well as some elite ones too. But the Epicureans were deeply egalitarian, but also not interested in politics, or they advised withdrawing from politics. But I think to partially answer your question, the actual history of the Roman Epicureans is instructive, because as much as the ideology of Epicureanism was drop out of society, live unnoticed, or have a very minimal relationship to politics, see politics as an unnatural, unnecessary desire. In fact, my understanding of the history is that many Roman Epicureans were involved in politics. And so, well, they had this philosophy they identified with that taught them that politics was not good, and yet they were engaged.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sense of that? Maybe
Right.
they saw their Epicureanism as a kind of therapy,
Oh, right.
but not as a permanent perspective. And so this question of engagement and disengagement, I think, doesn't have to be answered one fully or the other fully. I think we do migrate in our day-to-day lives and in our broader just experiences as citizens between different standpoints. And one of the insights I gleaned from ancient philosophy is that egalitarianism has something to say about both moments. That clearly egalitarian thinking can motivate our engagement, but in ways that you've alluded to and then that we're talking about a bit more, certain types of egalitarian thoughts can also calm you in your disengagement. But should people be engaged? Should people be disengaged? Can disengagement, that's really the question you're also asking, itself be a type of empowerment? That's an interesting question. And I think that, my most recent book is about Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And I assigned him some fairly original standpoints as a political figure. And one thing that really stood out to me was his pessimism about politics. Despite all of his changes over the last 60 years, he's consistently very skeptical about fixing our politics. And so he himself has been engaged, has been disengaged, and has been on both sides of this question. But I think there can be, not necessarily be, but there can be an empowerment and disengagement, but it depends on the circumstances. And to give you an example, I'm thinking of Dylan and his song "Let Me Die in My Footsteps" from 1962, where he's talking about how he wants to die, in a nuclear war, that he's not going to go build fallout shelters, and he's not going to go sit in a fallout shelter. And so he's disengaged in the sense that he's giving up on the possibility of taking action to stop there being nuclear weapons. That would be the more common way to have worried about the threat of nuclear war. Let's get rid of the weapons. But Dylan is singing in that song, in 1962, right when the Cuban Missile Crisis is about to happen. I'm going to die above ground, not below ground. And by the way, I kind of feel like the state is lying to me. There's some lyrics where he says that. And he was right. The US government was saying build these fallout shelters, not because they actually thought that people would be saved from a nuclear holocaust, but because they wanted to use Americans' building of the shelters to project to the Soviets America's preparedness to use nuclear weapons. And so even if the ultimate concern of the government of the United States was the safety of the Americans, they were enhancing the fear of their own citizenry by saying, oh, nuclear war might happen, but don't worry, we're going to build these fallout shelters and you can survive. That part really wasn't true. And so Dylan is calling in real time the bluff of the United States. And in that way, his disengagement, not building the shelter, not listening to them about how much fear he should feel, I think was empowering because it led to probably a lessening of his overall fear and was a correct call. So when disengagement is connected to refusing to go along with some form of indoctrination or some form of propaganda, of course, in those circumstances, it could be empowering. But I think that most of us deal with both phenomena. We are active and inactive, and we have both roles in our lives. And it's a very important question how to balance those roles. And maybe for young people in particular, trying to maybe figure out their own place in the world, their own professional commitments, and with that, their own political commitments. It's a big question, and I think that it's not one that I think maybe is going to have a single answer.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you for that super insightful response, and I really enjoyed the part where you connected it to your work and your most recent book. And I think this next question kind of connects in a little bit better with that as well. So we know in a very recent interview with Nick Gillespie surrounding your new book, you spoke about the American fascination with this horse race of politics and how the length of elections and how the spectacle of this election can really distract us from the more meaningful forms of democratic engagement. And as you probably know, our podcast is very geared towards youth and really tries to encourage more youth engagement inside our democratic system today. So we are wondering, beyond the concept of spectatorship, do you see any alternative frameworks that could help young people disengage from the whole spectacle and instead reflect on the next step forward? And what are some of those next step forwards? And what are the actions that the younger generation can do actively to better our democracy today?
Right. We've talked about a few different prongs. The conventional prong of being represented, having your voice be heard, trying to pass legislation that is in the name of your own interest or your own vision of the common good, and with that, trying to improve the equality and opportunity of the voting system and by extension, the education system. That's the familiar prong.
Right.
Then we talked about burdening elites, whether the economic elites and having them be singled out a bit more and playing a special role the way we single out the least advantaged. And another prong would be among the political elites to have them not just focus on what they say, but how they say it, and to have them be burdened on the public stage and shaken out of a kind of PR style control of their publicity, and have them engage in what I call candor, have to speak under conditions that they don't control.
Mm-hmm.
But a whole other prong, and this does come from the Dylan book, is to focus perhaps also on humanitarian politics, emergency politics, as I call it, and not just on conventional electoral politics. We live in a world of emergency where like never before, we who occupy relatively comfortable pockets of the world are aware in real time about distant suffering or suffering close to home, and are more so than in the past able to do something about distant suffering. We can, with a few clicks of a button, send money through Oxfam or UNICEF, etc., to people anywhere almost. And so this creates this brings us back to the question of engagement versus disengagement. How much do you give? How much do you, when is it okay to focus on your own life? But regardless of that challenge, that ethical conundrum, that is a prong. That is a venue, to maybe we shouldn't just think about democracy and political justice as getting our own nation state in harmony with the popular will, or, improving equality of opportunity. There always are those who are in extreme suffering in our current world, and one could always do something about them. And I think in this regard about Aristotle, who, asked himself, what is democracy at the end of the day? Is it the rule of the many, or is it the rule of the poor? And he thought that was a purely academic question because they would always overlap. The many are always the poor, and poor are always the many. But he did say that it was ultimately the poor, that was the defining feature of democracy. And if we riff off of that to some degree, we could say that a neo-Aristotelian approach in the sense of this conversation would be to see that it's not just a humanitarian interest in worrying about and helping to alleviate the suffering of those in the worst situations in our world, but a genuinely democratic ambition. And that we can fulfill our role as a democratic citizen, especially as a global democratic citizen, if we care more rather than less about the suffering. And sometimes the electoral system can blind us to it. That's sort of the polemical issue you're raising, that we can forget about that responsibility if we imagine our political lives only in the framework of which party am I supporting, how can I get my candidate elected, who's going to win. And in the US, where these presidential elections can go on for almost 2 years, I think it's a real problem because of the length of the election. And you can apply it to any context, of course. Like we're in a very charged moment in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Maybe the more conventional view when you think about how to be politically involved is to figure out, which side you support. But another perspective, which is not mutually exclusive with the first, would be, there are horrible suffering. There's horrible suffering going on. How can I take some action to alleviate that? Now, people can criticize this view as maybe being quietistic and apologistic about the status quo, but I don't think it has to lead to that. I don't think saying that the electoral system can blind us to emergency politics means that focusing on humanitarian emergencies necessarily excludes also caring about the more familiar kind of politics.
Right. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that really nuanced response. I guess that brings us to the end of our interview. And for our final and possibly toughest question, we wanted to end up on a fun note. So we know that you spent 8 years analyzing Bob Dylan's work for your remarkable book. As we talked about a lot of times in this interview, Bob Dylan, Prophet Without God. And while we sadly don't have enough time to fully dive into it today, we just have to ask, if you could only listen to one, or I guess to broaden a little bit, 1 to 3 Bob Dylan songs for the rest of your life, which ones would it be and why?
That is maybe the hardest question.
Yeah.
One of the great things about Dylan is not just his longevity, 60 years plus in public, but just the quantity of the output. I mean, you can meander through Dylan's work and find such different topics, perspectives, voices, concerns. And so the abundance is part of what's so amazing about Dylan. Joker Man, I think, is a beautiful song from Infidels. Idiot Wind has always been one of my favorites. And She's Your Lover Now, I think, is a special, maybe underappreciated Dylan song. But I could have given you 10 different answers to that. So,
Yeah, we'll definitely take a listen to those on our own time. All right. I think that concludes our interview today. Again, Jerry and I would like to extend such a big thank you to Dr. Green for this amazing opportunity and taking the time out of his very, very busy schedule to come here and meet with us today. We truly, truly appreciate it. We're truly inspired by and really curious by a lot of his work and are really, really excited that we had the amazing opportunity to speak with him today. We truly, truly appreciate it. For all the listeners and viewers at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.